Chapter 1. The Curtain Falls. The evening began with laughter. It was the closing night of Murder at the Manor, the first proper play Little Wytham's Amateur Dramatic Society had staged in nearly 5 years. The performance, held in the modest parish hall, had drawn a surprisingly full house, from the vicar's bemused presence in the front row to the fidgety teenage ushers who hovered around the back, hoping someone would trip over a prop. The audience, made up of local families, curious outsiders, and the elderly faithful, clapped heartily when the curtain finally came down, and the players, modestly costumed and beaming with relief, stepped forward to bow. "Well done, Alice," called Mrs. Weatherly, waving a handkerchief as she applauded her granddaughter's first major role. "Bravo!" Even Miss Marple, seated on the aisle, joined the ovation, though her expression was thoughtful. The play had been well executed, yes, but it was not the dialogue or the acting that lingered in her mind. It was the pause before the final blackout, when one actor, Mr. Felix Armitage, had stood motionless in the parlour set, staring into the middle distance with an intensity that felt almost too real. A few minutes later, the audience began to filter out, chattering merrily, discussing missed cues and creaky floorboards. But behind the stage curtain, in the cramped makeshift dressing rooms, the atmosphere was shifting. Felix Armitage had not returned for curtain call, nor had he reappeared in the green room, where lukewarm ginger beer and 2 trays of sausage rolls awaited the cast. "Perhaps he went home early," suggested Mary Greaves, the town librarian and self-appointed assistant director, as she wiped grease paint from her brow with a lace-edged handkerchief. "Don't be daft," muttered Gerald Finch, who had played the murder victim. "Felix never misses the chance to be clapped at. He lives for it." It was Elsie Booth, one of the stagehands, who finally pulled back the heavy velvet curtain and screamed. Felix Armitage lay crumpled behind the thick drape, his expression frozen in something between shock and terror. A slender ornamental dagger, one used in the play's second act, was embedded deep in his chest. The red was not theatrical now. It was real, and it was spreading across the once pristine brocade waistcoat Felix had worn with such vanity. The time the police arrived, summoned via the vicar's telephone and delayed slightly by the constable's bicycle chain slipping off, the scene was one of hushed disbelief. The hall, once so lively, had fallen into a strange, trembling silence. No one had left. No one had dared. Detective Sergeant Jack Larch, borrowed from the larger town of Market Wetherby due to the sudden seriousness of the case, stood over the body and exhaled through his nose. "Well," he said grimly, "that wasn't in the script." Miss Marple, seated quietly at the edge of the stage, watched him with mild curiosity. She had, of course, recognized something amiss before the others. It was not the lack of Felix at curtain call. That could be attributed to any number of egotistical whims. It was the performance itself, or rather, the end of it. Felix's final line had wavered, not in delivery, but in focus. He had looked, just once, towards the curtain's edge, not out of habit, but with expectation, as though he saw something or someone. Miss Marple folded her hands in her lap and tilted her head as the constable made a half-hearted attempt to cordon off the area with a length of bunting. She did not speak. She merely observed, because, as she had learned long ago, when murder came to a village, whether on stage or in truth, it was never an isolated act. It always began much earlier, with something whispered, or something hidden, and someone who thought no one had noticed. But she had. She always did. Chapter 2. The Village Reacts. The morning after the murder, little Witham woke to a pall of stunned fascination. It was not just the grisly death of Felix Armitage that set tongues wagging, but the manner of it. A murder in full view, so too. Speak, committed in the very heart of the parish hall, and with a prop dagger no less. It was a story far too juicy for even the most pious of villagers to ignore. At the Green Teacup Café, the usual murmur of conversation had become a low, constant hum of speculation. Well, I told Cyril not to let that Armitage man in the society, in the first place, huffed Mrs. Daffodil Price, her teacup rattling as she set it down. Too much drama, even off the stage. I heard he once threw a sugar bowl at a director in Basingstoke. And I heard, chimed in Mrs. Tewkesbury, that he was involved with that young Alice Weatherly. Disgraceful, if you ask me. Poor girl's barely 20, and him well into his 40s. Well, there was something going on, agreed Reverend Chudley's wife, lowering her voice conspiratorially. They were seen walking back from rehearsals more than once, and very late. A chorus of approving sighs followed, each woman basking in the warm glow of scandalous conjecture. Perhaps it was a jealous lover, someone muttered, or a rival actor. Or, said Mr. Horace Cribb, the butcher, with a morbid gleam in his eye, he choked on his own pride and fell on the knife. Miss Marple, seated alone at a corner table with her currant bun and weak tea, listened without appearing to do so. She sipped slowly, her eyes half-lidded, and appeared engrossed in her knitting, a modest lavender scarf for the church jumble. But inside, her mind was already assembling fragments. Felix Armitage had been an outsider, yes, but not in the obvious sense. He'd arrived in Little Witham nearly 8 months prior, having inherited the cottage on Windmill Lane from a cousin whose existence no one had previously known about. From the start, he had both charmed and unsettled. He was handsome in a tired sort of way, dark-haired, prematurely silver at the temples, with a voice smooth as silk and eyes that rarely gave anything away. He joined the dramatic society within a week, made himself indispensable, and quickly gained a reputation for taking the lead in every sense. He had friends, certainly, acquaintances, admirers, and at least one enemy, though most of the village would now claim to have always known. Something wasn't quite right about him. Miss Marple, of course, had made no such claim. She had simply watched, and what she'd noticed was this. Felix Armitage was a man who liked to be noticed, and equally liked to pretend he didn't. That combination, she thought, had very little to do with theatre, and everything to do with secrets. At the vicarage, Alice Weatherly sat curled on a stiff armchair with a wool blanket around her shoulders, a mug of untouched cocoa cooling beside her. Her mother hovered anxiously, offering suggestions that Alice neither heard nor answered. "He was so kind to me," she whispered once, barely above breath. Outside the study door, the Reverend Weatherly paced in silence. At that same hour, Detective Sergeant Jack Larch stood in the parish hall with Constable Evans, reviewing the body's placement and the blood patterns that had already been trodden through by half the village, before anyone had thought to secure the scene. The dagger was part of the second act, Larch muttered, rubbing the bridge of his nose. Supposed to be fake, rubber tip, but this one... He paused, staring at the bloodied handle. This one wasn't the prop. No fingerprints, Evans reported. Not even on the hilt. Wiped clean. Larch frowned. The murderer came, prepared then, swapped it out ahead of time. Would have had to know the script, the blocking. When he'd be alone behind the curtain, Larch turned to look at the stage, now eerily quiet, the dusty spotlight casting a ghostly glow on the velvet folds where Armitage had fallen. He exhaled. So, it's someone in the cast. Miss Marple returned home that afternoon, her basket light, her thoughts heavier. The sun filtered through her parlour curtains, painting her tea things in gentle gold. She sat down with her notebook, the one she never labelled, and wrote two things in delicate cursive. Who would want to kill Felix? Armitage? Then beneath it, who wouldn't? She tapped the end of her pencil against the page. In Little Wytham, everyone wore civility like a second skin. But some masks, she knew, were worn far longer than any actor on stage. And when they slipped, however briefly, the consequences could be deadly. Chapter 3. Threads of Doubt. By the following morning, a tentative quiet had settled over Little Wytham, the kind of silence that disguises tension beneath the surface, like still water before a storm. The Dramatic Society had suspended all future meetings, the parish hall was locked under police orders, and the velvet curtain where Felix Armitage had been found now hung stiff with blood and rumour. Detective Sergeant Jack Larch had taken up temporary office in the vestry, a decision that caused much discomfort to the vicar, who disliked the intrusion of officialdom into holy space. Larch, however, was a practical man and liked the vestry's heavy oak door and the privacy it afforded. On that particular morning, he was poring over a short list of names, the cast and crew of Murder at the Manor, each one now a potential suspect. He tapped his pen on the page as he spoke to Constable Evans, who sat opposite with his usual earnest frown. "I've spoken to 4 of them," Larch muttered. "Mary Greaves, Gerald Finch, Elsie Booth, and that girl, Alice Weatherly, denies seeing anything suspicious before or during the play." Evans cleared his throat. "Should we consider motive, sir?" "Always," Larch said dryly. "That's the problem. Everyone in that cast had one." He flipped through his notebook. Finch resented Armitage for taking the lead roles. Greaves was furious about changes Felix made to the script. Elsie had a row with him last week. He'd scolded her for tripping on stage. And as for Alice, he trailed off, eyeing the constable. Evans shifted uncomfortably. People say he was sweet on her. "They say a lot of things," Larch replied, voice flat. "What matters is what they won't say. Which brings me," he added, standing abruptly, "to the one person I haven't yet spoken to." Miss Marple was watering her indoor fern when the knock came. She answered the door with her usual placid smile, her lace collar neatly pinned, her blue eyes alert beneath snowy brows. "Detective Sergeant," she said mildly. "How very timely. The kettle just boiled." Larch hesitated a moment too long before accepting the invitation. Inside, the cottage was warm and scented faintly. of lavender and lemon polish, Miss Marple's parlour was the picture of harmless domesticity. Bookshelves lined with novels, a plate of seed cake on a doily, and a photograph of a young officer in faded uniform atop the mantel. "I won't take up too much of your time," Larch began, though he accepted the offered tea. "Of course," said Miss Marple, settling across from him with her own cup. "We must all do our part when there's been a terrible crime." He cleared his throat. "You were present at the performance. Did you see anything unusual?" Miss Marple took a moment to stir her tea. "I saw many things, Sergeant. But then, I always do." He raised an eyebrow. "Felix Armitage," she continued, "was a man who fancied himself misunderstood. But I suspect he was understood all too well. The villagers found him charming, but also arrogant. He had a way of needling people, of knowing just where to press." "You think someone snapped?" "Oh, no," Miss Marple said, sipping calmly. "I think someone planned, quite carefully. A murder like that, swapping a prop for a real dagger, it takes opportunity and intent, not to mention familiarity with the stage layout, which everyone in the cast had, indeed. But not everyone would know that Felix exited stage, left after his last line, or that the curtain would conceal him for a few final seconds before the blackout." Larch leaned forward slightly. "You think it was someone who knew the blocking intimately?" "I think it was someone who wanted it to look like an accident, or at least a crime of passion. But that was no momentary rage, that was precision." She reached for the plate and offered him cake. "Do you know," she said conversationally, "that Felix Armitage once lived in Totnes? I happen to recall reading a theatre review in the Western Chronicle. A curious bit of news about a cancelled engagement, a young actress dismissed rather suddenly." Larch frowned. "You believe there's a pattern?" "I believe," Miss Marple said gently, "that people often flee their pasts thinking it's forgotten. But they forget that the past tends to catch up, especially in places where everyone's watching, even when pretending not to." She smiled brightly. "More tea?" That afternoon, the village continued to murmur. At the butcher's, Mr. Cribb discussed daggers with exaggerated relish, while over at the haberdasher's, Mrs. Alder claimed she'd once seen Felix rifling through the donation box at the fete, and suspected he'd taken more than jam. At the Weatherlys' house, Alice remained in seclusion. Her mother had taken to sitting in the parlour, staring into the fire, her knitting untouched in her lap. Reverend Weatherly read aloud from the Book of Psalms each evening, but his voice lacked conviction. And in the locked parish hall, a second prop dagger was discovered. The real one, unblooded. Chapter 4. The Gathering Storm. The next few days passed in a strangely hushed suspension, as if the village itself were holding its breath. The Drama Society's battered stage had grown cold behind padlocked doors, yet its echoes clung to every conversation. Felix Armitage, though gone, loomed larger in death than he had in life, a fact that suited some better than others. Detective Sergeant Larch continued his methodical questioning, pausing long enough at the bakery for a fresh scone before heading to his next interview. He had already spoken twice with Gerald Finch, and found him both indignant and defensive. An actor too proud to admit envy, but not skilled enough to mask it. Mary Greaves had proven tighter-lipped, her answers exacting, and her eyes occasionally flickering toward the floorboards of the parish hall when mentioned. What Larch had not yet found was motive that truly held water. Grievances, yes, minor slights, artistic jealousy, petty squabbles over roles and egos, but nothing, so far, that felt heavy enough to wield a real dagger. Until now. It was on a rain-slicked Thursday afternoon, as he ducked into the library to avoid a sudden squall, that the case took a quieter turn. Miss Marple was already there, seated near the window with a volume of the Tragedy of Arthur open before her, though her eyes, Larch noted, were not on the page. Mary Greaves stood behind, the counter shelving returns. She nodded politely at the detective's entrance, but did not offer more. "Miss Marple," Larch said, taking the chair opposite, "do you believe people always mean what they say?" Miss Marple smiled faintly. "More often, they mean what they don't say. Silence, in my experience, is rarely empty." Larch tilted his head. "I've been thinking about Alice Weatherly. Her relationship with the deceased was more complicated than her parents admit," Miss Marple finished gently. "She is not the first young woman to mistake admiration for affection, nor will she be the last." He lowered his voice. "You believe she loved him?" "No," said Miss Marple, folding the corner of a page delicately. "I believe she thought she ought to. That's quite different. Felix Armitage was skilled at convincing others of who they were in his presence. It gave him power, the kind not easily forgiven when withdrawn." There was a long pause between them. Then Miss Marple added, almost as an afterthought, "Did you know that Miss Crampton, our schoolmistress, once auditioned for the society and was declined?" Larch blinked. "I wasn't aware. Felix made quite a display of rejecting her," Miss Marple said. "Called her wooden in front of 2 other members. It didn't make the gossip columns, of course, but it made an impression. Do you think she's capable?" Miss Marple's look was almost amused. "I think most people are capable of more than they believe. The question, Sergeant, is not whether they could. It's whether they would." Meanwhile, behind closed doors at the Weatherlys' home, tension brewed like an oversteeped pot of tea. Alice remained withdrawn, speaking little, her gaze distant. Her mother fluttered constantly, offering sandwiches and clean linen as if fear could be scrubbed from a house with enough effort. The Reverend had taken to reading aloud again, but his sermons had become subdued, circling the subject of forgiveness with uncomfortable repetition. It was during one such reading that Alice at last spoke. "He said I was talented." The room went still. Her father looked up from his Bible. "He told me I had presence," she said, still not meeting their eyes. "That I could go beyond the village, beyond Little Witham." Mrs. Weatherly's voice cracked. "Alice?" "But then," Alice continued, her voice sharp, "he stopped. He turned to Mary Greaves for everything, and he said I lacked conviction." The last word hung like smoke in the air. "I would never have hurt him," she said, and now her eyes were fierce. "But he used me, just like he used everyone else." The Reverend looked down, his knuckles white against the page. No one spoke again that night. That same evening, a quiet visitor arrived at Miss Marple's cottage. Gerald Finch, red-eyed and uncertain, stood on her step with his hat in hand. "I hope you don't mind," he said, "but I needed to talk to someone not wearing a badge." Miss Marple ushered him in without hesitation. Tea, as always, was waiting. He sat stiffly, eyes on the flames. "I didn't like him," Gerald said, at last. "Felix. He mocked my acting. Said I belonged in pantomime." Miss Marple nodded gently. "But I didn't kill him." She regarded him for a long moment. "Then why do you sound as though you did?" He looked up, startled. "I mean," she continued softly, "why do you sound as though you feel responsible?" Gerald deflated. "Because I do. The night before the performance, I saw someone slip into the props room. A woman. I didn't say anything. Thought it was Elsie fetching something. And now I'm not so sure." Miss Marple folded her hands in her lap. Chapter 5. First Suspects. The following morning dawned brighter, but it brought no clarity. Though the spring sunlight dappled the cobbled streets of Little Witham and caught the dew on the vicarage hedges, it did little to thaw the lingering tension. The village had slipped into the curious hush that follows any scandal, not from respect, but from a collective need to observe. Eyes peered from windows, voices dropped at the clink of a shop bell, and everyone, it seemed, had a theory. Detective Sergeant Jack Larch had spent the better part of the morning rereading statements, each one a variation on the same theme. "I didn't see anything. I was backstage. I thought it was part of the play." And yet every denial seemed too rehearsed, as though the whole village had developed a sudden, suspicious fondness for forgetfulness. At last he leaned back in his borrowed vestry chair and rubbed his temple. "Bring her in," he muttered. Constable Evans, hovering at the door, blinked. "Is, sir, Alice Weatherly. Time we stopped treating her like porcelain." Alice arrived just after 11, her mother at her side and visibly displeased. The girl looked pale but composed, her brown hair pulled into a tidy plait, her eyes strangely distant. Mrs. Weatherly protested gently to Evans at the doorway. "She's hardly well, Sergeant. Can't this wait another day?" Larch offered a non-committal grunt. "We'll keep it short." Inside the vestry, he gestured toward the chair opposite his own. "You and Mr. Armitage were close," he said without preamble. Alice nodded, then paused. "Yes, at first. And later." She hesitated. "We drifted. He lost interest, I think." "Did you?" Her lips compressed into a faint line. "Yes, eventually." "What changed? I saw him more clearly." Larch leaned in. "Did you argue with him on the night of the play?" "No," she said firmly. "I barely spoke to him. Just a line or two backstage. He was tense, but that wasn't unusual." Larch watched her closely. "We have reason to believe he received a letter before the curtain. Do you know anything about that?" Alice blinked. "A letter?" "Yes." She shook her head slowly. "No, he didn't say anything. But he seemed unsettled." "Yes, but Felix often played at being the brooding type. It was his favourite role." Dur scribbled a note, then glanced at her. "One more thing," he said. "Do you know anyone who might have had access to a real dagger, identical to the prop?" Alice stared at him, confusion etched across her face. "No, I don't. Think carefully." She hesitated. Then, in a voice suddenly quieter, she said, "Felix mentioned once that he kept a collection of antique Theatre props, knives, swords, pistols. He showed me one or two." Larch stilled. "Did he keep them at his cottage?" "Yes, in a glass cabinet, locked." "And who else knew about that cabinet?" I'm not sure. Mary, maybe. Gerald. Anyone who visited." Larch tapped his pen twice and leaned back. "Thank you, Miss Weatherly. That'll be all for now." Alice stood slowly. At the door she turned back. "I didn't love him," she said, "but I admired him, and he betrayed that." She left without another word. Back at her cottage, Miss Marple was not surprised when the knock came an hour later. "It was Mary Greaves. I thought," Mary said, her posture stiff, "that you might be able to explain something." Miss Marple gestured her in. Mary remained standing. "I found this—" She held out a folded envelope. "Under the chair where Felix sat during rehearsal last Tuesday. I thought nothing of it then, but now—" Chetier Marple unfolded the envelope. Inside was a single sheet of paper. The writing was sparse, typed with only 4 words. "You'll answer for her. No signature, no return address, no date." Miss Marple examined the folds, then looked up. "You didn't mention this to the police. I didn't know what it meant, and I didn't want to make things worse for Alice." Miss Marple's tone was mild. "Why Alice?" Mary faltered. "Because Felix toyed with her. He used her, humiliated her. But even so, if she sent this—" "I doubt she did," Miss Marple said gently. "Alice is clever in her way, but not cruel. And this," she tapped the paper, "isn't emotional. It's deliberate." Mary's eyes narrowed. "Then who?" Miss Marple smiled faintly. "That is what we're trying to find out." That afternoon, Gerald Finch paid another visit, this time to the police station. He arrived in a flurry, damp, from the drizzle and visibly nervous. "I've remembered something," he told Larch. "The night of the performance. I saw Miss Crampton backstage." Larch blinked. "Crampton? She wasn't in the play." "I know," Gerald said, "but she was there, just before Act 2, near the props room. I thought perhaps she was looking for someone. Did she see you?" "I don't think so." Larch rubbed his chin. "Interesting." And it was interesting, because no one else had mentioned seeing Miss Crampton at the performance. She'd claimed to have been ill at home, but if she had lied about being there, then what else had she lied about? Chapter 6. A Hidden Clue. Rain fell steadily the next morning, soft but unrelenting, turning the lanes of Little Witham to slick ribbons and dappling the stone path outside Miss Marple's cottage with delicate rings. But inside her sitting room all was serene. A fire cracked in the grate, and a fresh pot of Darjeeling sat warming beside a plate of digestives. Miss Marple, despite the gloom, looked altogether content as she returned from the hall with a folded note in her hand. A message, delivered discreetly by young Timothy Dorridge, the paper boy, who had been paid 2pence to post it directly into Miss Marple's hand. She unfolded it with care. There were only 3 lines. Felix lied about the locket. She knew it, and she told him so. Ask about the play change. Scene 2. Someone was listening backstage, unsigned. She read it twice, lips pressed into a fine line. A faint trace of lavender clung to the page. That afternoon the rain lightened to a mist, and Miss Marple took her usual slow stroll through the village. No one paid her much mind. They were used to the sight of her. Tweed coat, sensible shoes, small gloved hands clasped behind her back. Just the old lady from St. Mary Mead, visiting again. No one noticed how closely she watched the faces in shop windows, how she lingered, ever so slightly, outside the schoolhouse, where Miss Crampton taught arithmetic with military precision. Inside, Miss Crampton paused mid-sentence when she saw the older woman through the glass. A flicker of something crossed her face, recognition perhaps, or apprehension. Miss Marple merely nodded and moved on. Later that day she called upon Mary Greaves at the library, who was surprised but too polite to decline the company. "Such a bleak afternoon," Miss Marple said, settling her wet umbrella in the stand. "I thought I'd browse the old parish festival programmes. I do so enjoy the variety of themes." Mary gestured toward the archive shelf. "The second drawer, on the right." Miss Marple found what she was looking for quickly. A yellowing programme from 4 years prior, when the Dramatic Society had staged A Shattered Silence. A different cast then, save for Mary. But something stood out. "Mary," she said gently, "do you recall if the play performed last week was the same as the version submitted to the printer for the programmes?" Mary blinked. "Yes, why?" "There's no scene 2 in this one, just a transitional monologue." Mary frowned. "That's strange. Scene 2, yes, with the confrontation between the maid and the master, that was added later. Felix wanted more tension. He said it would showcase Gerald. Did he also write the new dialogue himself?" "Yes, all of it. And was there a locket?" Mary's brow furrowed. "Yes, actually. The maid wore it, a family heirloom. It was meant to prove her real identity." Miss Marple nodded slowly. "Funny," Mary said, more to herself now. "He was so particular about that detail." Meanwhile, at the constable's office, Detective Sergeant Larch was puzzling over the mounting inconsistencies. The note discovered in the vestry, "You'll answer for her," still sat folded on his desk, now joined by a second, retrieved by Evans from Felix Armitage's cottage. This one was even more cryptic. "You can't bury what still shines," Evans had found it tucked in a book of poetry on Armitage's bedside table. No envelope, no indication of its writer. Larch stared at it for a long time. "Evans," he said finally, "check every prop list from the Society's records. I want a catalogue of every item used the night of the play." "Sir? We're missing something. Not just who used the dagger, but why they chose that scene. Why the locket mattered. Why the change." Evans gave a quick nod and vanished into the rain. At that moment, Miss Marple stood in front of the village well. It was no longer in use, sealed off decades ago when the new water lines were installed. But it still sat in the green behind the parish hall, overgrown and half forgotten, with ivy creeping across its old stone rim. She peered into the shadows. Then she leaned in just slightly and dropped a small pebble. No echo came. She looked around once, then turned and walked away. Back in her sitting room, she opened her own notebook and began to write. Felix knew who she was. The locket was real. The scene change was deliberate. Not theatre, confession. Someone didn't want it told. She paused. Then she wrote one final line. But someone else wanted to hear it. That night, the wind rose again. Windows rattled gently in their frames, and curtains stirred in their hooks. And in Little Witham, the villagers slept, or tried to, each with their own thoughts. Guilt, worry, secrets long buried, and one, at least, with a growing dread that Miss Marple knew far more than she let on, because she always did. Chapter 7. The Echo in the Well Miss. Marple had always believed that murder, like weeds in a well-tended garden, never appeared suddenly. There were always small signs, wilting leaves, shifting soil, a shadow that lingered too long. In Little Witham, the murder of Felix Armitage had grown from something old, something festering beneath polite smiles and dramatic monologues. By Friday morning, the village had moved from whispers to wariness. People greeted one another with tight smiles and glanced over their shoulders when crossing the green. Felix's empty cottage stood like a stage with the curtain drawn. Doors locked, windows dark, yet still watched. At the Green Teacup Café, two women paused mid-conversation when Miss Marple entered, their silence unconvincing. She offered her usual polite nod and took her seat near the window. She did not need to eavesdrop. She already knew what they were saying. It's Alice, poor girl, clearly heartbroken. No, it's Mary Greaves, always jealous, always second best. Or that Miss Crampton, bitter as wormwood, and not half as sweet. Miss Marple sipped her tea and mentally crossed off all three. They might each have had cause, but their tempers ran too hot. The murder, by contrast, had been cold. Precise. No, this was not the work of an impulsive woman scorned. This was theatre, yes, but the kind that ended not with applause, but with silence. Later that day, Constable Evans arrived at the vestry, office breathless and damp, his boots caked with mud from the hall's undercroft. "Sir," he said, holding out a velvet pouch, "you're going to want to see this." Detective Sergeant Larch opened the pouch carefully and pulled out a small oval-shaped locket. It was ornate but tarnished, the gold faded, the clasp stiff from age. "Where?" he asked. "In the base of the props chest, taped beneath the false bottom." Larch examined it in the light. "This matches the one in the script, doesn't it?" "Yes, sir, but here's the strange bit. There's a photograph inside." Larch popped it open. A tiny portrait, sepia-toned, of a woman young, with dark, serious eyes and a high lace collar. It looked nothing like Alice Weatherly. "Who is she?" Evans asked. "No idea, but I'd wager Felix did." He pocketed the locket, his mind racing. So there had been a real locket after all. Not a prop, but something Felix had inserted into the play deliberately, hiding it behind fiction. And someone had gone to great lengths to retrieve or conceal it. But why? Back at her cottage, Miss Marple received a second note. This one had no envelope, only a torn piece of theatre script folded twice and pressed beneath her front door mat. She came from the south. So did he. They thought no one knew. But secrets sink, even in dry wells. Miss Marple stared at the words for a long time. Then she fetched her hat and walking stick and set out once more, this time for the old well behind the parish hall. She arrived to find Elsie Booth already there. The young stagehand stood with her back to Miss Marple, staring into the tangled ivy and stones, as if trying to see through time. When she turned, her expression was tight with guilt. "You knew I'd come," Miss Marple said simply. "I didn't mean to lie," Elsie whispered. I didn't know what to do." Miss Marple waited. It was after rehearsal. A few days before the performance, I saw Felix arguing with someone. Not shouting, just intense. And it wasn't Alice. It was Miss Crampton. Go on. I didn't hear it all, but he said something about the past catching up. About a girl who should have stayed buried. Miss Marple's eyes narrowed slightly. Elsie lowered her voice, and then she said, "If you bring that up on stage, I'll make sure no one hears you ever again." That night, a storm rolled over the village, thunder low and grumbling in the distance. The windows rattled in their panes, and the candle flames danced like nervous whispers. In the vicarage, Alice stared into the fireplace, her hands clenched in her lap. Her mother watched from the doorway, uncertain whether to interrupt. Reverend Weatherly sat in the next room, leafing through a book he had not read in years. In her schoolhouse cottage, Miss Crampton carefully peeled labels from old letters and tossed the scraps into the fire. Her jaw clenched as she watched the flames eat the corners of her secrets. And in Miss Marple's quiet parlour, the locket sat on the table beside the script, open, waiting. Miss Marple finished her tea and made a final note in her diary. The play was not written for entertainment, it was written for revelation. But the past does not like to be summoned on cue. She closed the book. Some performances end in ovation, others end in silence. This one, she knew, had been meant to do both. Chapter 8. Miss Marple Tests the Stage. The next morning broke grey and sullen, with low clouds crouching over the rooftops of Little Witham like a weight. It was a Saturday, but the mood was far from restful. Word had spread, though not through official channels, that the locket had been found. Whispers grew louder in the bakery queue, eyebrows lifted higher at the grocer's, and one could barely get a cup of tea without hearing Felix Armitage's name muttered like an unsettled ghost. Miss Marple, however, was unhurried as ever. She walked to the vicarage just before 11, carrying a small parcel in brown paper and a look of calm curiosity. The Reverend Weatherly met her at the door, startled but polite. "Miss Marple, I wasn't expecting a visit." "No," she said gently, "but I imagine you were expecting someone." He blinked behind his spectacles. "I beg your pardon?" She handed him the parcel. "You may recognize this. Inside was the locket, closed and cleaned, no longer tarnished but gleaming like an accusation. The vicar's hands trembled as he held it. This belonged to Clara." Miss Marple's eyes didn't blink. "Clara? My cousin," he said softly. "From Exeter. She died years ago. Tuberculosis. But Felix, he knew her. They'd met before he came to the village. I thought as much," Miss Marple said. "And the photograph?" He swallowed. "Yes, she gave it to him. They were close for a time." "More than close," Miss Marple said. "He kept the locket even after moving here. And when he joined the Dramatic Society, he wrote that second scene, the one involving a mysterious girl from the South and a family heirloom, not as fiction, but as confession." Weatherly sat down heavily in the armchair near the fire. "He told me he wanted to clear her name. There was a rumour, an accusation, before she passed. He thought someone from her old school had made a false report, that it ruined her. And that someone," Miss Marple said, "was Miss Crampton." The silence that followed was confirmation enough. An hour later, Miss Marple stood once more at the threshold of the parish hall. It had reopened for rehearsals, not of a play, but of memories. Detective Sergeant Larch and Constable Evans were inside, reviewing set layouts and line of sight. Miss Marple asked permission for a short demonstration, and Larch, curious despite himself, agreed. She moved to the stage. "Elsie," she said, motioning to the young woman who had been summoned at Miss Marple's quiet request. "Could you stand where Felix did in the second scene?" Elsie hesitated, then stepped behind the curtain, standing in the same shadowed space where Armitage had given his final performance. Miss Marple turned to Larch. "Now, imagine you are an audience member. Where would your eye be drawn?" "To centre stage," he said. "The monologue." "Precisely. Which means," she said, walking to the wings, "that if someone wished to approach from behind, unnoticed, the moment would be perfect. Everyone else would be watching Gerald Finch deliver his overwrought speech about lost honour." She paused beside the curtain and ran a gloved hand along the edge. But someone was not watching the stage. Someone was backstage, standing in the dark, listening to a scene that sounded very much like real life. She turned, and when they heard their name, veiled but unmistakable, they acted. Larch frowned. "We still don't know what weapon was used." Miss Marple smiled faintly. "Oh, but we do. Or rather, we will. The real dagger wasn't just a convenient duplicate. It was Felix's, from his private collection. He'd planned to use it in the final act of the play as a symbol, a theatrical flourish, but someone found it first." Larch exchanged a glance with Evans. Miss Crampton? She was never cast, but she was often nearby, claiming to help with lines, with makeup, with props. She was present enough to know the new script and what it revealed. She confronted Felix days before the performance. Elsie overheard. She denied being at the play, Larch said, and yet Gerald Finch saw her, just before the second act, in costume, no less. Larch blinked. "Costume?" Miss Marple nodded. "The maid's cloak. A piece she had been helping to mend. She slipped it on, thinking it would disguise her in the dark." Larch straightened. "I can bring her in." "No," Miss Marple said calmly. "Let me speak to her first. She knows I'm watching. I think she's waiting for someone to understand." That evening, Miss Marple received a knock on her door. She was not surprised to find Miss Crampton standing there, her grey hair drawn into its usual bun, her features composed but brittle. "Fortune, I come in?" she asked, voice strained. Miss Marple stepped aside. For a long time the two women sat across from each other in silence. The fire crackled. The clock ticked. "He was going to humiliate me," Miss Crampton said at last. "Right there, in front of everyone. He didn't name me in the script, but I knew what he meant." And the locket? Chapter 9. The Truth Between Lines. By the following morning, Miss Marple had already taken tea and read both the Church Times and the Little Witham Gazette, which, in its latest edition, had reluctantly acknowledged the tragic loss of local thespian Mr. Felix Armitage, while carefully omitting any mention of daggers or motives. She clipped the article neatly, slipped it into her notebook, and glanced at the sky beyond the window, clear at last, but still cool, as if the weather itself remained cautious. News of Miss Crampton's quiet visit had not yet leaked into the village, but in a place like Little Witham, secrets never stayed buried long. Already whispers were shifting focus. Alice Weatherly's name no longer passed so frequently through pursed lips. Suspicion now lingered around Miss Crampton like the scent of mothballs, subtle, persistent, and hard to shake. But it wasn't quite enough. Miss Marple knew from long experience that confession and closure were not the same thing. A confession might satisfy the law, but truth, real truth, was often tucked in the folds, between words, beneath performance. And so she found herself once again at the parish hall that afternoon, where Gerald Finch was pacing near the piano, lines from the new spring production fluttering in his hands. He looked up at her, startled when she entered. "Oh, Miss Marple, I wasn't expecting—" "No one ever does," she said gently. "May I ask you something?" "Of course. You were very devoted to Felix, weren't you?" Gerald flushed. "Well, I admired him, certainly. He was bold, inventive, a bit arrogant, yes, but that's the mark of all great performers, isn't it? Yet he never gave you a lead role." Gerald looked away. "He said I didn't have the presence." Miss Marple tilted her head. "And still you defended him." "I didn't kill him," Gerald said abruptly. "If that's what you're circling toward." "No, no," Miss Marple said with a kindly wave. "But you saw more than you let on, I think." He hesitated. "I didn't tell Sergeant Larch this, but I knew about the locket. Not just from props. I'd seen it before. In Felix's cottage, on his nightstand." Miss Marple raised a brow. "He told me it belonged to someone he'd wronged. Someone whose name he wouldn't say aloud. He said he kept it as a reminder." "A reminder of what?" "That he owed someone the truth." Miss Marple's gaze softened. "Did he say how he planned to deliver it?" Gerald looked toward the stage. "Only that he wanted people to hear it. That he'd spent too many years pretending. That the theatre was the only place he ever felt honest." She nodded slowly. "Thank you, Mr. Finch. That helps more than you know." Later that day, Miss Marple walked the quiet path behind the parish schoolhouse. The breeze stirred daffodils and teased laundry on the lines, but the windows of Miss Crampton's cottage remained shuttered. Miss Marple didn't knock. She left a note instead, tucked beneath the door, folded neatly. It read, "The locket was never about Clara. It was about you. Felix never intended to destroy you, only to acknowledge you. The scene was a confession, but also an apology. You mistook his shame for cruelty. But we all do sometimes. No signature, just her handwriting. Round, firm, unmistakable." She walked away. By evening, the atmosphere in Little Witham had shifted again. Like the final page of a novel quietly turned, a hush fell that wasn't discomfort, but something nearer to understanding. Detective Sergeant Larch stopped by the cottage just after supper. His manner was brisk but not unkind. "We're wrapping up the case," he said. "Miss Crampton's confessed, but the Crown prosecution might go soft on the charge. Manslaughter, temporary derangement maybe. She's already resigned from—" "The school," Miss Marple nodded. "And the locket?" he asked. She handed it to him. "It was never evidence," she said. "It was a key." To what? To motive and regret. He accepted it with a quiet grunt. "One thing still puzzles me," Larch added. "She claimed she acted alone, but someone left those notes for you." Miss Marple's eyes twinkled faintly. "Yes, I believe someone did, and I believe that person is quite finished playing ghost." He frowned. "So you're not reporting them?" "No harm done," she said. "Sometimes people want the truth to come out, but don't wish to be named in its telling. I understand that." Larch shrugged. "Well, far be it from me to argue with results." He tipped his hat and took his leave. That night, the curtains at the parish hall were drawn back once more, and the society rehearsed for their spring production, The Merry Wives of Windsor. Light affair. No daggers. No hidden truths. Miss Marple sat in the back row, knitting in her lap, her needles clicking softly as Gerald flubbed his line and Elsie burst into laughter. Even Mary Greaves allowed herself a small smile. The village, it seemed, had chosen to go on. But Miss Marple, ever watchful, knew that some echoes never faded entirely, especially the ones whispered behind curtains. Chapter 10. The final Pattern Sunday arrived with birdsong and sun, as though the clouds of the past week had finally exhausted themselves. Church bells rang out from St. Luke's, their chimes bright and untroubled, and for the first time in days Little Witham felt like itself again, bustling with quiet purpose, gossip politely suspended beneath hymns and garden chatter. Miss Marple attended the morning service, seated at the end of the fourth pew in her usual unobtrusive manner. She was dressed in pale grey, a modest hat atop her silver hair, her gloved hands folded patiently in her lap. She listened carefully to the Reverend Weatherly's sermon on forgiveness, delivered with more tremor than usual, and afterward made polite conversation with Mrs. Beckett about jam recipes and the foxgloves beginning to bloom too early. But beneath her gentle civility, Miss Marple was finishing the last of her mental stitches, tightening them one by one until the pattern of the murder lay clear and complete. It was not enough to know who had struck the blow. That, in the end, had been as much an act of panic as intention. The real question, the one that always mattered most, was why it had been allowed to happen. That afternoon, Miss Marple took tea with Mary Greaves at the back garden of the library, where a fresh breeze rustled the newly sprouting lavender. "I must admit," Mary said, pouring with a steady hand, "I didn't think Miss Crampton capable of anything so dramatic." "She's a very proud woman," Miss Marple replied. "Pride is a lonely thing, when it's been bruised for too long." Mary sipped. "Still, she might have spoken out years ago, instead of letting it fester." "She might have," Miss Marple agreed softly. "But then, many people might have done many things, if they hadn't been so terribly afraid." Mary looked down at her teacup. "I suppose I've always known that Felix was dangerous," she said, almost too quietly. "Not in a violent way, but he enjoyed playing with people, their feelings, their fears. Yes," Miss Marple said, "he treated the stage as a mirror, but he made sure everyone else's reflection was sharper than his own." Mary glanced up, startled. "You don't seem angry." "No," Miss Marple said, "because I've seen his sort before. They're not wicked, not truly, but they wound without knowing how deep the cut goes." She let that hang a moment, then smiled. "You're planning to continue with the Dramatic Society?" Mary blinked, then nodded. "Yes, I think so. Gerald and Elsie are keen to carry on. We'll keep things simpler, of course." "That might be wise," Miss Marple said. Though I do hope you still allow room for a little mystery on stage. The village rather enjoys it." They laughed together gently. In the early evening, Miss Marple returned to her cottage, where she found a single envelope tucked beneath the mat once more. This time, however, it was not unsigned. She opened it to find a letter in an unfamiliar but tidy script. "Miss Marple, I owe you thanks, not just for your patience, but for your kindness. I couldn't speak aloud, not after what happened with Clara, with the school, and with everything that came after. Felix said he would write the truth into something beautiful, but he didn't warn me how close it would cut. I didn't mean for it to happen that way, but when it did, I couldn't turn back. Yours, Ian C." Miss Marple folded the letter carefully and placed it in the box where she kept her pressed violets and birthday cards and old train tickets, things not quite precious, but never forgettable. She stared at the fire for a long time, not because the mystery still lingered. No, the truth was complete now, but because she understood the fragility of a person pushed too long into silence. Miss Crampton had committed a crime, yes, but it had begun with something much smaller. A lifetime of watching others be believed while she was not. That was a wound that healed slowly, if it healed at all. The following day, Constable Evans delivered the final report to the County Inspectorate. Sergeant Larch moved on to a theft in Bishop's End. The Dramatic Society posted a cheerful flyer in the village square for their next production, The Importance of Being Earnest. And Miss Marple, with her needle threaded and her thoughts at rest, sat in the garden by her roses, adding the final stitch to a sampler she had begun the very week Felix Armitage arrived in Little Witham. It read, "There is nothing hidden that shall not be revealed." And though she smiled at the familiar scripture, she added one more line, small and crooked, but unmistakably hers, even behind the curtain. Chapter 11. The final echo. It was a Tuesday morning in Little Witham when the unexpected letter arrived, addressed to Miss Marple, delivered not by hand or by the village postman, but by a passing coachman on his way to Market Harborough. Miss Marple, who had just returned from picking blackcurrants in the garden, accepted it with a mild look of surprise, and a quiet thank you. The envelope was pale ivory, the handwriting unfamiliar. She opened it in her parlour, with the fire low and the rain beginning again outside. Inside were 3 items: a theatre ticket stub dated 6 years ago, a page torn from an old Exeter newspaper, and a single sheet of notepaper, folded crisply, in half. She read the note slowly, her brow gently furrowed. "Dear Miss Marple, I suspect you know by now that Clara was not merely Felix's muse, nor a tragic cousin of the vicar. She was my sister, and she was ruined by a lie. Miss Crampton's lie. Felix promised me long ago that he would tell the truth, but he waited too long, and by the time he wrote it into the script, it was already dangerous. I warned him. I even begged him to remove the scene, but he insisted. People need to know, he said, and now he's dead. I did not kill him, but I stood by when others plotted. I knew what Miss Crampton was capable of, what fear does to a woman who's built her life on pride, and still I said nothing. I hid backstage that night, behind the curtain, just to hear Clara's name spoken again. I wanted to see it played out, to imagine justice delivered. Instead, I heard the sound no audience ever should. Silence where there should have been a line. Then the scream. I never meant for it to end like that. Please keep this to yourself. Let the village have its peace. Let her live with the truth. That's justice enough. Yours sincerely, Mabel Linton, Miss Marple. Let the letter fall lightly into her lap. The name was not one she'd heard in the village. Perhaps she'd seen Mabel once or twice, sitting quietly at the back of a performance, or posting letters with gloves on, even in summer. The kind of woman who knew everyone, but was known by no one. There was a faint trace of theatre powder on the envelope's crease. Miss Marple, who noticed such things, noted it and said nothing. That afternoon, she walked to the edge of the green, where new flyers were going up on the community board. Theatre resumes next Saturday. Gerald Finch had written in large, hopeful letters. She read it once and turned to go, but a voice stopped her. You'll be attending. It was Elsie Booth, her expression uncertain. If I may, Miss Marple said with a small smile, I think I rather enjoy a good farce. Gerald's rewritten the second act, Elsie said. No ghosts, just misunderstandings and lost luggage. How very appropriate. Elsie hesitated. Miss Marple, do you think it's over? Miss Marple looked toward the church spire, the schoolhouse, the sealed well, and finally the shadowed hall where so much had been unspoken. Yes, she said gently, but some echoes take longer to fade. They stood in silence, the air fragrant with lilacs and memory, and somewhere far off a magpie called out, a single sharp note cutting across the green like a curtain call. Chapter 12. Miss Marple Reflects. The spring fete arrived in Little Witham with bunting, lemon tarts, and the kind of sunshine that seemed to forgive everything that had happened during the winter. On the green, tables had been arranged beneath fluttering ribbons. Children ran between booths with sticky fingers and laughter, while the vicar judged a Victoria sponge competition with the solemnity of a man choosing a bishop. Miss Marple, seated beside the rose trellis near the jam stand, wore her Sunday best and watched it all unfold with the practised serenity of a woman who had outlived both scandal and sentiment. She sipped her tea, politely accepted 2 scones, and made gracious remarks about the rhubarb harvest. But in her lap rested a slim folder, its contents recently delivered in person by Detective Sergeant Larch, who had grown over the course of their acquaintance to listen more carefully to her pauses than to most men's speeches. You were right about Miss Linton, he had said, handing over the case summary. No criminal charge, of course. She didn't commit the murder, but she knew. And said nothing, Miss Marple murmured. She thought justice had been done. Miss Marple, who believed justice and vengeance were not always twins, simply nodded. Now, as the brass band struck up a cheerfully off-key rendition of God Save the King, she reread the final summary. Miss Crampton had confessed, though. She claimed panic, not premeditation. The weapon, a real antique dagger, had been traced to Felix's personal collection. Miss Crampton had seen the revised script days before the performance. She had known immediately that her past, once protected by silence, would soon be spoken aloud to an audience of neighbours and pupils. And she had broken. The tragedy, Miss Marple thought, was not only in the death of Felix Armitage, who had toyed with truths and paid the price, but in the slow suffocation of Miss Crampton's life, spent walling herself in behind rectitude and bitterness. But the deeper sadness lay in what Mabel Linton had done, and not done. She thought silence was safer, Miss Marple murmured to herself, watching the children play near the village well. But silence, in its own way, is a kind of violence. She folded the file away and turned to greet Mrs. Weatherly, who offered her a second cup of tea and an anxious report that Alice had taken a position at a girls' school in Brighton. "Urture. Fresh start," the vicar's wife said hopefully. "Yes," Miss Marple said, "though I hope she leaves the past behind, and not herself with it." That evening back at her cottage, Miss Marple watered her geraniums and penned the final line of a letter to her nephew Raymond. It was not a case of blood, Raymond, but of buried pride and twisted remembrance. And as always, the truth was not in the evidence, but in the emotions left unspoken. Fortunately, I have long since learned to listen not just to what people say, but to what they cannot say. She paused, tapped her pen once on the blotter, then added, "The performance has ended, and the actors have bowed. But I expect as ever that the village will return to itself. That is both its greatest strength and its deepest weakness." Outside, the sky blushed lavender. Swallows dipped through the dusk. And far off, beyond the parish green, a small group of villagers rehearsed their lines under the golden glow of the hall's windows. Laughter echoed from within. The curtain, metaphorical and literal, had been raised once more. And Miss Marple, quietly watching from her sitting-room window, allowed herself the smallest of smiles. For now, all was still, but she would be listening, as always.